Good evening, everyone. I'm Lee Chui Lin, and welcome to our webinar today, which is the sixth under the Malaysian Education Blueprint series, a collaboration between BFM, G25, and EdUnity Malaysia. So, I'm sure if you're joining us, you know our topic today is unity and equity, both of which are very charged, very, very nuanced issues. And we have a lot to unpack. We have many speakers, so I'm going to get right to introducing them. First up, please welcome Jason Wee, co-founder of Architects of Diversity Malaysia, which is a non-profit initiative that aims to bridge communities and identity groups among youth in Malaysia. Jason, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Next up, we have Dipti Kumar, educationist and CEO of the Malaysian Collective Impact Initiative, which is a collective impact organization for education in Malaysia. Dipti, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chui Lin. Excited to be here.
And joining us is Dr. Oe Sun, Socioeconomic Analyst, to discuss his experiences and provide political insight. Sun, thanks for being here. Ooh, I think, Sun, you're on mute, actually, but thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Sorry, yeah.
No worries. And finally, we have Cheryl Hamdan, No Information Chief, sharing his views on how education contributes to national unity. Cheryl, welcome.
Thank you.
So just to say right up top, please send any questions and thoughts you have in the comment section. We're going to try to take as many of them as we can as we go along in the next hour. So I did think that a good place to start would be getting a picture of where we stand in our schools at the moment, with both Jason and Dipti, I think, helping to give us the lay of the land, so to speak. Jason, let's start with you. So Sekolah Semua and Architects of Diversity conducted a national discrimination education survey last month, and I have to say the results were rather disheartening. Could you share what the survey showed us in terms of where we are with unity in our schools?
Thanks, Lynn. I think before going into results, I think when we talk about, unity and equity, we first kind of need to understand that we've been knocking on this door since pre-independence, right? Our education seemingly regressing in terms of our education system's capacity to become an instrument for conflict resolution. When we conducted the survey on Sekolah Semua, we really asked the question, when kids of multiple backgrounds and diverse backgrounds are in school, does the environment foster equity? So our recent retrospective Sekolah Semua survey showed half of Malaysians have experienced perceived discrimination in school, with that number being higher for younger Malaysians. So young Malaysians who are between 18 and 30 years old. I think beyond, the fact that discrimination is very harmful for both mental and academic performances, when we talk about discrimination, we have to consider that these negative interactions can be detrimental for intergroup trust and relationship in Malaysia. And so really the survey demonstrated there is a big gap in terms of enforcement and monitoring mechanisms, both at the student level as well as the teacher level. We don't have a good sense of collective definition and framework for what constitutes discrimination. I think so far, many of our discussions around Bangsa Malaysia, many of our discussions around Paduan have been quite superficial in the sense that they paint a very positive image. But what's happening in schools may be portraying a different image and different reality that is experienced by many.
And while we are going to be spending a lot of time on unity, equity is the other half of the title of the webinar today. And the blueprint does emphasize the aim of providing education for every child, regardless of geography, gender, or socioeconomic background. And Dipti, I wanted to ask you really, would you say that's being met? I mean, in terms of the work you do, what are the key challenges you've observed when it comes to this issue of equity?
So I think first to very quickly unpack what educational equity means. Globally, right now, there is no set definition, but what it means in general is ensuring that every child receives the resources, the support, the learning environment to acquire lower order and higher order thinking skills to maximize their individual potential, right? So when we look at equity and ensuring a system is equitable, you look at data for minority groups, right? That's normally where you start off. So in Malaysia, we of course talk about firstly children with different learning needs, special education needs. We'll talk about minority ethnic or racial backgrounds, and of course, taking into account we have a multiracial population and we also have indigenous communities. And also talking about socioeconomic background. That is a key part in education equity, I must say, because just as a very quick example, last year when the first lockdown was announced, we approached our schools to continue supporting them education-wise, PDPR online. But about 85% of our B40 beneficiaries lost their source of income overnight. And more than 70% did not have sufficient food or basic needs for the next week and the next month. So we are then thinking, how do we support them in education or achieving education equity when they don't even have the basics? So, I mean, that's in general how we would approach what educational equity looks like. Now, in terms of the policy in Malaysia, in the Malaysian Education Blueprint, we do unity and equity are the two values they mention. And specifically talking about equitable education, it's mostly on shift 1, where there's equal access to quality education of an international standard, especially focused on increasing investment into physical and teaching resources for children with specific needs. Now, how does this actually play out in the schools, right? So we have an 100% acceptance or 0% rejection for students who come into the school. And I would like to focus slightly more on children with special needs, but this applies across the spectrum for all the different categories of minority groups, right? So we talk about 100% acceptance or 0% rejection. Then we think, does that actually equate to equitable education? Are we then actually supporting every child that comes into the school system? And actually, if you look back a few years ago, why we cannot use an acceptance rate to define or measure equity is, for example, a few years ago, Malaysia reported our literacy rate to be about 95, 96, 97%. And just to give a comparison, our neighboring country, Singapore, reports their literacy rate at about 99%. They are the highest literacy rate in the world. But actually, when you go back to Malaysia, we report enrollment rate as literacy rate. But when we go on the ground, we see that just because you're enrolled in school, you cannot assume that the child is fully literate. And the same applies here. So when I go specifically now into the classroom, we support a number of schools in and around Klang, and one of our schools, SK Abdul Samad, has special education needs classes. And through our support and engagement with them, our policy or our MEB might be written out pretty well, but there are key challenges. Firstly, there is a challenge of parental awareness and education surrounding children of different education needs. How do they identify them? And also, how do they support them? There's still a lot of taboo that is happening on the ground surrounding special education needs. And beyond that, it's also assessment. Are teachers equipped with the right skills to be able to differentiate in the classroom, identify traits, and work on it constructively in a way that parents can, access and really grow from that? I mean, there's the surrounding sort of challenge in terms of language and culture of true inclusivity. If we want to achieve education equity, and in this particular case, I'm talking about special education needs, the whole system needs to be based on true inclusivity. It needs to show in our language. It needs to show in the skills. It needs to show in all the different small policies that are happening across the education system. I mean, and finally, of course, teachers are a very core part of our system. We've heard this before in this webinar series. They are the role models. They are front-facing. It's really important that we support teachers in this particular area because they are the ones who are really going to be able to ensure we achieve education equity. I mean, so that's the background of our experience on the ground in terms of what education equity means and actually how it plays out. A lot of parents are not willing to get the children even assessed to go into special education needs classrooms. So there's a huge challenge before they even get into the system.
I did want to touch on something you brought up there, which is considering the difficulty in addressing this in a holistic fashion, right? Like you point out, it isn't one single thing. It isn't even one group of students, and it isn't always everything that's happening just within the classroom or within the school setting that affects education equity. So with all these things in mind, then, what work are you doing to try to address this or to plug some of these holes?
So at MCII, we are the first collective impact organization in this region. And basically, to summarize what we do in one word, it's collaboration. We believe that it takes a village to raise a child. I'm sure all of us can agree on that. And we try to use the collective impact model, which was coined by University of Stanford and actually was formulated in the US. We try to use it and sort of make it suitable for the Malaysian culture. We've been around 5 to 6 years, and we try to get every single stakeholder involved in the school to take mutual ownership of the child's learning, right? So what we've done so far is we engage with everyone from the school leaders, school teachers, parents, school staff, from cafeteria management to security guards, the local policemen in charge of those particular schools. We get community leaders together. What we want to do is we don't want to go in there and try to tell the teachers or schools what they should be doing or tell the communities what they need and give them a solution. But we want to bring everyone together and start getting everyone to take ownership of what they're doing. And we have seen great success in that, especially in the past 2 years when the pandemic has, really made the school environment very challenging for everyone in that space. We've seen how schools, school leaders, teachers, community leaders are taking ownership of their own growth and learning today.
So at this point, I did want to say again that we are planning to go for about an hour or so. So if you'd like to send any questions or comments, please send them our way as we go along. We'll do our best to answer. And I did also want to take this opportunity to touch on, I think, one of the central issues at the heart of this issue of unity in our country, and that is the push and pull between national schools, or the idea of a single stream of education, and what we currently have, which is multiple streams, multiple forms of schooling. And I'd like to start with you, Ehsan, because you graduated from Kian Kok Middle School, which is an independent Chinese school in Kota Kinabalu. You are a UEC holder. And I thought perhaps you could give us some background on what led you down this educational path, and whether, how you think it affected your relationship with the country, with Malaysians of other cultures.
Wow, that's a very grand question, but thank you
It
very
is.
much. Well, I went to a national type primary school, Chonghua School, which was founded by my grandfather, incidentally, about a century ago. And then there was a primary school, and therefore the main instruction language was in Mandarin, but we do have English and Bahasa lessons. And then I went to this Chinese independent school, Kian Kok, as you mentioned. Chinese independent schools typically, at least in Sabah, they emphasize three languages equally, namely Malay, English, and Mandarin. I mean, there are some independent schools in Malaya, for example, which teach primarily in Mandarin. But in Sabah, I think it's quite evenly spread between the three languages. And I did sit for the UEC, but I also sat for SPM as well. So we had to, in a sense, study about like two different streams of education. So we had to, have classes in all these subjects are instructed in Malay as well as in English. So it was tough, but I think it made me whom I am today, namely be able to hopefully converse in various languages. And I think diversity is the strength of this country. Very often it boils down to how you would like to define the term unity. If you define it as everybody, for example, studying and practicing in let's say one language or one culture, then indeed the country perhaps should have one single stream of education. But if you believe that unity could be found in diversity as well, then well, you will have these different streams of education. The Chinese stream, the Tamil stream. But not only that, we also have the international schools and the private schools, right? So I think the fact that we are educated in these different streams, it reinforces our ability as a trading nation and as a society which embraces diversity to be outward looking. You look at many other countries, I would even say with some of those advanced countries like Japan or even Korea and so on, right? Granted, they're very advanced, but if you go into their culture, immediately you have difficulty, for example, getting familiar with them. Whereas you see when foreign investors, when tourists come to our country, immediately they feel very much at home because we could probably speak most of their languages. So for me, I see diversity as a strength, and I'm very gladful that we do have this sort of multi-stream education. Thank you.
And I want to return to some of those points, but at this point, I'd also like to bring Cheryl, you into the discussion, because you've been vocal in the past about the need for single stream schools in the name of national unity. You're also on the record, for example, for opposing the recognition of the UEC. And I thought perhaps you could tell us more about those viewpoints.
Sure. I think education in Malaysia, like many things in this country, is really about balancing different goals and sometimes conflicting goals. So I think off the bat, we recognize, and I think the previous speakers have done a have done a great job and basically implying that it's about balancing different goals and sometimes conflicting ones. When it comes to education, are we speaking about unity? Are we speaking about equitability? Because those two things are related but not the same. Are we speaking of quality? Are we speaking of respecting heritage and legacy in this country? And finally, maybe are we speaking of practicality, what we can actually achieve? Because keeping the peace is not sexy, but it's really part of what this country tends to do, right? In all our decision making, make that what you will. So when it comes to education and the school system, my position really isn't one of only assertive viewpoint that only one school system can work. My view is really that the variety or diversity in the school streams and the fact that there are various, or rather there are large numbers of people who go into these different school streams, right, would then by definition mean that young people of different ethnicities and different socioeconomic classes tend to not mix together. So I'm less enamored about the fact that languages are different and all the rest of it, but it's more the fact that there's 90% of ethnic Chinese parents send their kids to Chinese national type schools, and that by definition means that less of them are in national schools. So because there's less mixing, less interaction from a very young age, I think that is a barrier to unity. When it comes to things like the UEC, from similar viewpoint, I worry that there is too much of it adds to the pull factor when we recognize it to the same level as national schools. It increases the pull factor away from the national schools that I think is the only one stream that once improved, and it has to be improved, can be the area and the space in which we solve this not mixing together problem. So I keep going back to that because that's really, I think, the point that I'm trying to make in all discussions about the fact that we're diverse school streams. How are we going to solve for the problem that while we respect the different contexts and the different heritages, if you will, of this country, and the fact that that is reflected in the different school streams, how do we solve for the fact that they will not be able to grow up together as much as we want them to? I also want to recognize on the record, and I think people have said this many times, you can't only attack the pull factor, and I recognize this. There's also a push factor in the way that SKs and SMKs, the experiences of minorities, experiences of ethnic Indians, especially in Jason's study, show. That's clearly a push factor away. And it's no use only critiquing things around the UEC recognition. It's no use of people like me and Amno saying stuff about how we're going to have to get people into SK if we don't recognize that there's something clearly problematic about the minority experience in sekolah kebangsaan. So when stories like minorities asked to eat in toilets, clearly that erodes confidence. Add to that all sorts of other news and reports of discrimination. You have then both the push and pull factor, which I think makes this conversation this issue about unity in education very, very difficult to unpack. So when I speak about UEC recognition, when I speak about how we try and persuade people into a single school stream, I'm not speaking of which of an assertive or legislative change, nothing like that. But it's more of an aspiration, and there needs to be give and take on both the push and pull side of the equation.
Which leads me to a question actually that I'd like to open up to everybody, which is something that you, Cheryl, just brought up, which is the idea of the push, right, of national schools themselves and the concerns surrounding them, both in terms of the standard of education available and also whether they capture a sort of diverse, inclusive spirit as they are at the moment. And I think the question, therefore, and pardon me for another grand question, but this is a grand topic, how can we make national schools more representative of the Malaysia that we would actually want to live in? And I'll return to you, Cheryl, in a bit, but Jason, I thought you could start us off.
Yeah, and that's a very important question because I think the debate so far has gone around vernacular schools for so long, but we know that there is a political deadlock for it, and there's questions of language rights among minorities surrounding vernacular schools. I think to really understand kind of this issue, we need to trace back the enrollment history between national schools and vernacular schools and realize that pre-May 1369, vernacular schools were under-enrolled. Many were shutting down. It was only post-May 13 that there was a revival and great attraction for minority groups. So I think returning to the question, right, how do we make national schools national again? Is exactly, I think Cheryl's right. It's rather how do we attract minority students back into national schools? I think to answer this question, we need to see enrollment not necessarily as a process to unity, but an indicator that we are creating spaces that minorities and of all backgrounds, right? I think even if you're living in a majority Chinese town, if you're Malay and you prefer to go to an SK rather than sending your child to a predominantly Islamic school or international school, that's also a great indicator. I think this question of how do we attract minority students back into national schools is greatly intertwined with education quality, as previously mentioned. And I'm sure previous webinars have covered this quite extensively, but also is greatly intertwined with equity, because I think for many minority parents, the question on their mind is that, will my child get a fair shot in the national system? And I think this calls into questions, questions of real and perceived ideas about whether a school will discriminate against my child, but also on larger scales, like whether my child, because they go to a national school, will they be affected by quotas? How will their scholarship prospects come about? And obviously the real, very tangible concern about language and the larger political arena about language in Malaysia. So I don't think it's an easy question. And I think it's going to be quite a difficult way to get there. And I think obviously we can, start with obviously kind of eradicating discrimination, which is in and of itself, why are we starting, only so long after, our education system was properly established. But I think beyond getting to a neutral ground, we need to ask, even if we get all our students into national schools, because I've walked into many schools around the country and students are still segregated according to race in SMKs, because most SMKs flow back and are quite diverse. So the question is as well, how do you make sure interactions in national schools are of good quality that move us towards intergroup empathy and understanding, or however you want to define unity, right? Because sure, I think there's this old pedagogical method of nation building, of emphasizing rukun negara and national identity that doesn't really cut into the real conflicts that kind of sit at the political and interpersonal level. Previously, there was an Oxford study on national service where they found that there were negligible improvements for NS alumni compared to non-NS alumni. So at least at Architects of Diversity, what we're trying to do is we're finding robust interventions, both at the student level, so the short courses we run, the programs we run with students, that even at national schools, how do we make sure those environments are properly safe and not only diverse, but are also inclusive for everyone? Because the difference between diversity and inclusion is often lost in some. And then obviously we have the teacher level, right? Because I think we've definitely heard from Ayan's case and the kind of backlash. Ayan Hussein says, obviously, the whole case surrounding the sexual harassment joke and the backlash that came about that. Are our teachers equipped to handle this kind of responsibility, to create these kinds of environments? Because that, is not that's a tall order. It's not an easy task at all. At least for us, we're trying to pilot, a diversity, equity, and inclusion collective for teachers, but it's such a long way to go. Many of the studies that we currently have about how discrimination and how diversity affects different groups are often Western-centric. They're not studied in Malaysia whatsoever. And so we have very little data to go on. And so we first kind of need to invest more and explore more into this field, because there's not a lot of money going into this, as well as there's not a lot of open field for research at the moment.
Dipti, you spoke earlier about this, or rather you touched on it. Perhaps you could expand. I mean, what are some of the challenges here?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Essentially, how can we make national schools diverse, inclusive, and I think at the standard that we want them to be. So they are attractive to everybody and every student.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you look at what a school should represent, a school should reflect what the world out there is like for our children today and in the future, a future that we don't know what it's going to look like yet, right? So, in essence, the objective of an education system, it needs to be the underpinning objective. The objective of the education system needs to be children, different backgrounds, different abilities, experiencing different stimuli together, encountering problems and finding solutions together. Three key things I would say in this would be personalized learning to ensure every child has their own sort of gaps and strengths honed in a way. Skills development, equally important to academic, certification and papers, and also character education. Character education is very big fancy word to refer to unity, working together, So actually, how do we think? What can be a possible solution? We need to make sure our education system, everyone who works in this education system is working towards one objective, which is to have a school that truly reflects what the world out there is like for our children. It cannot be influenced by religion. It cannot be influenced by politics. And we cannot take a 50-50 or middle ground approach on that. That's what the education system should really represent. And for inspiration, we can look to our neighbors. And in fact, we can look to some people here, some of our friends here locally as well. Some of our friends very passionate about education equity at the Surin Academy. They are showing us how you can drive a proof of concept of integrated and inclusive learning with children of all different learning types. Now, I mean, I'm using stereotypical words, but mainstream and special learning needs, different backgrounds, different local, foreign, all together in the same classroom, working on skills and academic development. We can also look at, on a national level, our neighboring country, Indonesia. A lot of very inspiring transformation is happening today in a country that consists of so many islands spread across. We can definitely get much inspiration from that. I'm very reluctant to give one key line on a solution because just to land on to what Jason said earlier, it's a long journey ahead and it's a systemic thing that we need to address. But I would say the one key thing is we need to make sure the objective that underpins our education system is right.
Ihsan, you spoke about this, you touched on it earlier as well, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Well, I think Dr. Mahathir, before he resigned earlier last year, he was, I think, for 1 month acting the education minister. And I recall in one press conference, he said something to the effect that, why don't the Chinese and the Indians send their kids to national schools? Well, because the national schools have become religious schools. So, well, and then he prescribed his solution, right? Saying something like, you must teach math and science in English and so on. Then, the national school will be great. And then the Chinese and Indians will send their kids to national schools again. I don't divert too much from his opinion because I think it's very important, number one, to make sure, as a previous speaker said, the national schools will reflect the diversity of our nations and not, be too centric upon any one culture. Number two, the emphasis on math and science. We see, for example, in Klang Valley, a lot of these Chinese schools, and namely, I think it's a primary national type of Chinese schools, as well as even the Chinese independent schools. They have, in Klang Valley, I think up to 15% of students are non-Chinese because, parents from other races, they also send their kids there. And to be blunt about it, number one, discipline. Number two, math and science, higher standard, and so on. In Sabah, you see an even higher percentage. There are some Chinese schools in Sabah. We're up to 90% non-Chinese enrollment, and in average in Sabah, any one single Chinese school have up to 30% of non-Chinese as well. So, I think it is important, number one, to improve the standards of our teaching. If we find that before 1969, national schools were the schools of choice for all sorts of parents, then we try to see, what did they do right then, and try to, take away those things which which were perhaps not so right afterwards. And I agree with Dipti also that there are a lot to be learned from our neighboring countries. I mean, everybody will rush to say Singapore is the best, perhaps, but also, as Dipti said, Indonesia, Thailand, and so on. Let's look at how they are doing in the school systems, and perhaps as neighboring and developing countries, there are lessons for us to learn. Thank you.
Cheryl, you started us off really on this track talking about this push and pull. What are your thoughts on how we can increase the pull factor on the side of the national schools?
Right. Definitely look very seriously into what the children and the parents say. There's a lot of cynicism about the validity of some of these surveys, and I think that's not right. We ought to really be fair and sincere when we make decisions based on whatever information is on the ground. So if, for example, you get the survey that came out a couple of months ago or last month about the kinds of discrimination and the kinds of remarks that minority children who go to the national schools have encountered, the experiences they encountered, then I think there needs to be strong legislative push to make not just legislation in parliament, but the kind of rules and procedures that don't require laws, that are operationalized at school level and at PPD level, to ensure those complaints are addressed and those kind of behaviors are really taken action against. So that, I think, is the first step, to really appreciate and listen to the experiences of minorities who are discriminated against, rather than saying this is just invalid response. So that's one. But more broadly, even before you listen, or even without going through each and every comment, there are certain things that from all our experiences, I think we can agree on. The reason I feel, one of the biggest reasons I feel people are hesitant to send their children to national schools on the basis of not having a fair shot, as Jason said, or being discriminated against, is some of the markers of the perceived or possible discrimination happen in even the way the school start WIM is done. So meaning, the kind of seriousness that is put into celebrations of different ethnicities. So to make it more specific or tangible, if you're going to make a big deal out of Hari Raya celebration, you ought to make the same kind of deal for Chinese New Year or Deepavali or any number of other celebrations. That's one. Two is, as I really agree with what Jason said, even if you get them interacting in the same school, even if you could, under ideal scenario, have all of them in one type of school, but if you're going to segregate them just because it is ideal or it helps the timetable to have all the ethnic Malay Muslim kids in one class or in a couple of classes, and then not let them interact with the non-Malays, non-Muslims just because they go to a couple of different subjects, I think that's also a shame. So having those kind of reforms, which I don't think is that big of a step, could begin to improve the pull side of the equation. Can I just quickly react though to, if you don't mind, to what
Please.
Dr. Ehsan said just now, because I've heard this argument multiple times that we shouldn't point out the fact that, or you shouldn't point out the argument that non-national schools contribute to non-unity simply because you have evidence that in many national type schools, SJKCs, vernacular schools, there are many Malays or ethnic Indians into SJKCs and vice versa, similarly in SJKTs. Meaning to say, the argument is that the vernacular schools are quite diverse. So I don't contest that. I think that's great. But I think the argument is a bit flawed, Doctor, if you don't mind, because that wouldn't even be a point if the vernacular schools and the other streams didn't exist, right? The fact that they are more diverse than the national schools is kind of like the same problem, because I would just rather have a situation where we could have more children of different backgrounds, especially ethnic backgrounds, growing up and interacting together. I understand the legacy issues. I understand how difficult this is. I understand, someone can just easily throw out about Islamic type schools and Islamic schools and all the rest of it, right? I know from your smile, Trillion, that's about stuff that's going in your mind now. I recognize all of it. I recognize how difficult this is. But whatever we can do to reduce the push factor away from mixing together, and whatever we can do to improve the pull factor for people that want to go to the same school compounds and being together, grow up together at that very young and impressionable age, I think we ought to fight for that. And I know some people have commented, what about national service? I think was it Jason who mentioned that the surveys done showed that people went to NS and people who didn't go to NS, the impact on unity not really significant. Maybe that's the point, because they're going to NS when they're 17, they're 18. But surely it makes a difference if you start interacting with people with different backgrounds at the age 6, 7 versus 17. And that's the hypothesis, right, that I have, and a lot of us surely have. And it's so hard to prove it because we've really done it at a large scale. And where it does happen, it happens in middle class backgrounds where, you're not getting the same variables in play.
Actually, I wanted to ask Isan whether you'd like to respond just briefly before we go to some questions from people who are tuning in.
Well, again, I think it goes back to how do we define unity, right? I'm also all for people to be able to interact from a very young age, but if the price to pay for that is less opportunity to sort of inherit your own heritage and so on, so then we have to make a judgment call as to what is more important, right? For example, the recognition of UEC and things like that, frankly speaking, sometimes, time is indeed a very amazing solution. By now, actually, the recognition of UEC, at least for me and many of my classmates when we discuss with each other, is actually not that important anymore, because, nowadays, you have many different university choices, right? You could go to some of those private universities and so on. And after you graduate, you still get a job. It's unlike previously, you have only the national university, the national type of universities whereby you could get your tertiary education. So again, you see, that's an amazing thing about, choices and diversity. By having all these private universities which opened up since the 1990s, the recognition of UEC, some really ardent Chinese so-called educationists, they are still getting at it. But frankly speaking, practically speaking, I don't think it's as important an issue as before. And, when we do have all these choices around, for me, if we were to take away these choices instead, I think is something which perhaps is not very good for the long-term, I would say viability, but presentability of this country. I think in the long term, we should present this country as one of diversity. Strengthening national school, it's indeed very important, so that, as some of the speakers said, it would become the school of choice for a lot of parents and students. So I think that you could not sort of do it by banning other types of schools. You have to strengthen the national schools so that they become the preferred choice. Just like many of these private schools nowadays, you see parents from Malay, Chinese, and Indians sending their kids there. And even universities, you see more and more parents, they would save money in order to send their kids to these private universities. Yeah.
So I don't think that this sort of decades-long issue is one we're going to resolve in a 1-hour webinar. But thank you both very much for, I think, laying out quite clearly some of the issues that lie at the heart of this, right, at the push and pull between. I did want to take some questions that we're getting. So one that I think is really for you, Dipti, as someone who works in the school system at the moment. Mohammed Sharif wants to know, are there not instructions to headmasters that they should take immediate disciplinary action on teachers who insult students on the basis of race and religion?
Yeah, so in our schools today, I think we need to make sure we look at two things separately, policy and implementation, right? So there might be a policy on anti-discrimination, or even if it's not written down, it's an understanding, right, that we do not condone or promote racial or religious issues. I will say that there is a problem with the culture in our education system, where we are more like, I say we, meaning the school, the teachers, the HM, are more likely to push these under the rug, because any publicity is bad publicity in this space. Of course, they might, have a conversation with the teachers who might do something discriminatory, but the whole culture does not support the headmaster, headmistress, does not support the teachers, does not support the PPD, the JPN. They are not supported to actually address these issues. I mean, I can go on giving you anecdotal evidence of times that we have been in schools and seen this happen, and disciplinary action, all of this is just words. There's so much that happens on the ground, and it's beyond just, teachers insulting a race and religion. It is about, when I grew up, Bulan Ramadan, I cannot eat in school, right? And just sort of loan to Cheryl's point earlier, Hari Raya, since I was young, almost a week-long public holiday. Deepawali had no public holiday until a few years ago, just before Najib's elections, right? So, I mean, these are small things. Public holidays don't matter as much. But how do we show this across the whole system? There's a cultural challenge in this. And no, are issues of discrimination on race and religion being addressed in the schools? No, if we still have a quota system, if we still talk based on majority and minority racial backgrounds in our schools, then, I mean, look at scholarships, right? I'm previously a scholarship recipient. Out of 11 scholarship recipients, 2 non-Malays, 1 Chinese, 1 Indian. These are the things that people observe and people live out every day. So we can talk about policies, or teachers are informed by headmasters, or headmasters and headmistress should take disciplinary action. They also have human relationships with these teachers and with the PPDs and with the students and with the parents. So there's so much more. And my quick answer to that would be, no, it doesn't necessarily happen all the time in the way that we would like it to happen.
We have a pair of questions, both of which are for you, Cheryl. One is from Malik, one's from Dashran, and they both focus on the issue of religious schools. Malik wants to know, do you think that it should be under the purview of the MOE? And Dashran wants to know your thoughts in general, especially in terms of the kinds of diversity they represent.
So you're trying to get the question right. So it's about Tafiz schools?
Tafiz schools, and whether they should be under the purview of the MOE, and separately, right, thoughts on religious schools as a whole in terms of diversity.
Okay. So first question, I have to say I don't have a strong opinion about whether it should be on MOE's watch or not. I think, yeah, I lean yes. I'd like it to be, so that it's more monitored, and I suppose we ensure that the content is consistent with whatever the national curriculum is and whatever national agenda the education system wants to put. But not a very strong opinion, partly because I don't know enough about that particular section of this topic. More broadly, does religious schools assist in increasing unity? Obviously, it's not part of the ideal scenario that I spoke about and always speak about, and they exist for a different reason. So at the very start of this program, when I first responded to the first question, I said, like many things in Malaysia, education in Malaysia is about balancing different priorities. In a world where Malaysia was a secular country, where it wasn't so where religion didn't play a central role in our everyday life and in our identity, then maybe we'll have a different solution. But this is one of those compromises that I think Malaysia agreed to, and our forefathers agreed to, and it's one of the things that doesn't assist in the ideal scenario of people coming together. I realized the implication of my answer, and I realized the implication of what that means whenever someone like me says, like, let's go back to one stream, or let's hope for a single stream. But I think the fact that we have certain no-go areas for different reasons, right, doesn't preclude us from aspiring to web and work towards improving that unifying component. Because if you do things sequentially, and if it's always black and white, and whataboutery or whataboutism dominates, then we'll really never get anywhere. So I think where the solution space is, where we can work towards, we play in that space. So what lies outside the solution space? So obviously religious schools. What lies outside the solution space is obviously banning vernacular schools, which I'm completely against. Which is obviously in banning UEC, which, for the record, I'm not. I'm simply saying let's not recognize it more than it really is. So that those two things outside the solution space, but within the solution space, let's really focus on trying to contain the attractiveness, if you will, of the other streams and improve the attractiveness and the appeal of the SKs.
So before we close off today, I think one of the central themes, and it's coming through in the messages we're getting also, is larger issues of discrimination that live outside of the education system, right? And I'd like to bring it back at this point to one of the findings in the Discrimination in Education survey that we started off with, in which non-Bumiputra respondents reported greater perceived discrimination from government policies in education than Bumiputra respondents. I thought, Jason, you could tell us more about this particular question and what the findings were.
Right. I think first, I want to say that we do not have anti-discrimination policies. We often clump discrimination with other cases of bullying and other cases of unfair treatment. That is not the same. Discrimination is categorically identity-based, right? And so when, I think around 2018, there was about to table a discrimination bill. That was a hope for policies to help create a framework for discrimination, but obviously that was taken off the table. I think when it comes to, the tension between Bumiputras and non-Bumiputras perceiving policies as discriminatory or not is a tension between discrimination and affirmative action, right? I think this word, I'm surprised, hasn't come out yet. But I think the question to this is, at what point does affirmative action cease to be affirmative action and instead becomes discrimination? I don't think it's an easy question for three reasons. The first one is that I think there's a huge gap in our framework for understanding this concept. Even the US, even other countries that are implementing affirmative action for decades otherwise, are not at the point to question whether AA is discrimination just because of the unique framework that we have in Malaysia. I point obviously to Dr. Lee Hock, who does amazing research about what constitutes affirmative action and how do we improve it. And education is itself a big question, a big instrument for equality. So the discussion and inputs about education and scholarships should be purely based on merit ignores the fact that quotas and particular scholarships is very important, right? If you want to uplift, say, Orang Asli communities, Indian communities, you still need these instruments for corrective measures, right? But when do we roll back, and are we measuring achievement well and outcomes well? The second thing is, and I think linking back to that, is that we don't have good data, quite frankly. A lot of whether discrimination kind of toes AA or not, it really is about understanding our social sphere and socioeconomic achievements of various groups. And that's why I think, in terms of perceptions of policies, whether they're discriminatory or not, you would find that a lot of non-Bumiputras would find that that somewhat equality has been achieved. And I think particularly bolstered by the fact that many affirmative action opportunities were perhaps seized by higher income Malay groups rather than going to proper B40 communities. But the issue is really, coming back to it, that we don't have much data. One case in terms of domains, so in terms of schools, in terms of academic achievement, in terms of admissions, where these resources are going to and how they fare afterwards, we don't have good data on that. Secondly, we don't disaggregate data. So when we talk about groups and discrimination and how we attribute success to each group, we first need to kind of, describe it a lot better. The data that we currently have, as little as it is, doesn't disaggregate Malays from Orang Asli and Orang Asal for a large part. So it's very difficult to disaggregate from that part. I think a third thing is that research on race and religion in schools is really difficult. We conflate oftentimes discussions and inquiries about race and religion with incitations of racial and religious tensions. Our Sedition Act, as it currently is defined, kind of is pretty blanket and broad in the sense that even I, as a kind of civil society member operating in this field, I'm pretty scared because it clearly could be categorized into that definition because of its broad strokes. So because of these multiple reasons, it has created some of a cloud, and a kind of a cloud that has grayed and kind of not allowed us to see past this idea of perceptions. Because a lot of the difference between how Bumiputras and non-Bumiputras perceive whether a policy is discriminatory or not, we don't have a good ground to determine the truth just yet.
So, Cheryl, I thought you could touch on this. What kind of work needs to be done then to resolve this issue of a perceived discrepancy when it comes to our education policies?
In particular about?
I think when it comes to the fact that, for example, non-Bumi respondents within the survey reported greater perceived discrimination, how do we bridge that gap?
So I think I answered part of it just now. We really got to listen to them and trust them at their word in the first instance, rather than doubt it. So I think that's something that I hope, especially the Malay community, is ready to do. That's one bit of it. And addressing the other pain points in terms of the school experience, rather instead of just explicit discrimination or incitations of racial prejudice, but the experience itself. So things like apart from the examples that we mentioned already, things like improving the access to, I suppose, Mandarin education or Tamil education in national schools. It will require a multi-year preparation in terms of the teaching staff to be able to do that. But I don't see why that's impossible. But having the aspiration will be key. So getting to the point where the school experience at SK level is really markedly different than whatever is being reported now. I also know that when it comes to education, even though this tends to happen later in life, this issue of scholarships. This issue of scholarships is a pain point for as long as I've been alive. I remember writing an article. It was one of the first articles I wrote after I got the Bank Negara scholarship, and at that time was maybe slightly more idealistic than I am now, as happens with age. It's probably somewhere online. I basically, as a 17-year-old, lamented very naively, I think, lamented why is it that people doubt that I got that scholarship on merit. And obviously that was a lament of somebody who was 17 and very self-centered at that point. Didn't see the bigger picture maybe, but it was more of, even I felt frustrated because I felt that people always doubt, and they were always, Cheryl got that scholarship because he was, and that annoyed me at that time. At this point, it doesn't really matter anymore. But this issue of scholarships, I think we need a government and we need an administration, and sure, it will almost always be a Malay-led administration, but an administration that's ready to look at this issue of quotas and scholarships in a different way. Affirmative action for a particular ethnicity, this might get me in a bit of hot soup, I'll just say it anyway. Affirmative action for a particular ethnic group, if defined so broadly, should only apply if the ethnic group is almost uniformly disadvantaged. And maybe there was a time in history it was the case that although Malays, Bumiputras were a majority community, but they were quote unquote minority in terms of economic opportunity or educational opportunity. I don't think one can make that argument sincerely now. Even within a Malay party, I don't think you can make the argument. The Malay community is so diverse already. There are numerous numbers of cases where the Malay experience is one of cosmopolitanism, one of success, economic advantages, that we really need to not scale down the affirmative action, especially when it comes to education, but really just define it more specifically. So even if for the next 10 years, we cannot get away from a Malay quota system, at least be sincere enough that for JPA scholarships, Amara scholarships, it has to be for people of a certain economic background. So fine, if you want to do a quota for Malays, you cannot get away from that in the next 10 years because politics won't allow it. At least for the Malay quota, ensure that there's no cases of people who, whose parents send them to school in Mercedes and then they get the scholarship. So those kind of things, right? That really kills the pull factor I talked about. So, those kind of things, I think my party and whoever is in government, which, probably will be a Malay PM, right, for the next few years, that person and that administration is to be bold enough to come up with that kind of change. Because I don't think that's a big leap. I can sell it. As UMNO information chief, I can imagine, and even as UMNO Youth is known to be right-wing, more right-wing than the standard UMNO, I think even I can sell that to a Malay audience to say, look, we need to be fair, not just to the non-Malays, but also to the Malay community that actually help. And all this cable scholarship stuff need to stop. And very quickly, just 10 seconds, another scholarship idea you could do is a completely non-racial one, where you bring back the idea of education as a social mobility tool. Say, for example, you identify people under a certain level of income, people whose parents have never been to university, and you hold their hand all the way from primary, secondary to university. Have a budget for 20,000, 50,000 of those folks and those families. Begin to make that scholarship the big one. Then I think you begin to solve this problem in a way that's practical and doesn't cross or kill any sacred cows too quickly.
Yeah, if I may just add on to Cheryl's point, actually, and I'm not going to touch on affirmative action or quota, but actually on scholarships, you're absolutely right. Some of my Malay and Bumiputra friends, or when we were in the scholarship camps, they actually shared a frustration. We were experiencing frustrations, and they too. And their frustration was like, wait a second, did I get these scholarships? Like, was I genuinely meant to receive them? And these are friends I have a lot of respect for. And this happens everywhere, right? I'm just using anecdotal examples. So I totally get what you're saying, Cheryl. There's experience on both sides that we need to look at and address. And also to speak more, I guess, candidly on Malaysia and scholarships. I just want to say that actually our country does a really good job at providing tertiary scholarships to Malaysians. You go anywhere else in the world, you go to Europe, you go to England, you go to Australia. When you talk about scholarship, their understanding of scholarship is different. We are one of the only countries, I mean, there are a few more, that provide extensive tertiary education scholarships to Malaysians. So I want to say we actually do a great job on that. And how we do that, I guess, needs to be, further refined. I know JPA slashed their budgets a few years ago because they didn't have money, but how can we review this moving forward? And how can we ensure our affirmative action basically has not gone way over the balance of what it should be? 2 out of 11 people, that doesn't show me merit-based, right? And when I say merit-based, exactly what Cheryl said, we need to look at socioeconomic background. We need to look at potential. We need to look at your parents' income and earnings. It's not just a race thing, right? Just to add to that point. Thank you so much. Shuilan.
So no worries. And thank you for bringing that up. We just have 5-10 minutes, if I'm pushing it, left to go. And I thought that we could end this session on a more hopeful note, if we can. So I'd like to ask each of you, what do you think should be the most immediate priority when it comes to fostering unity in Malaysian education? Ehsan, I thought that we could start with you. Oh, you're on mute.
Well, I would like to re-emphasize the importance of diversity in in our yearning for prosperity in this country. And having gone through my own experience, I firmly believe it is possible to achieve unity through diversity, or at least through choice as well. One suggestion besides scholarship, it's also to relax a bit the quotas on public university placements. Even if you're not going to give scholarships, well, at least you should relax the quotas a little bit in terms of non-Malay students going into public universities. That would, I think, also strengthen the so-called pull factor. It's a pull factor of the national schools, right? So that non-Malays, when they go to national school, they know that it will be greater chances to go to public universities and so on. And very quickly, just two brief points about equity. I've touched on unity a lot, but equity. Number one, and it's also a very dangerous thing for me to say as a Sabahan, I think education should be a basic right for, well, anybody who live in Malaysia. And I say this with a caveat because in Sabah, there are a lot of so-called undocumented people. Many of them, unfortunately, are not afforded the opportunity to get educated at all. We are talking about at least 1 to 1.5 million people. We are not talking about, just be like 10,000 people. So they depend on, in a sense, the charity of a lot of private initiatives to run some forms of schools for them. So I think somehow we should include them in our national education system. Number two is, of course, this sort of distinction between the traditional way of education versus this, for example, technical vocational education and training. I think we should have more opportunities and more encouragement for people to go into so-called TVET, if they don't like to study in normal streams, such that they could also become, very much gainful in their future employments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Jason, your thoughts?
I think I'll end with two things. So the first one is that truth-seeking must come first. I know no one wants another commission, but we need a proper investigation on data, a release of data, and a declassification of it. It deserves to be done quickly, independently, and accurately. And this must be at the onus of the government. The second thing I'll say is that I think rather we've talked about this topic since ages. We can talk about it till the cows come home. But what would really change is a rights-based approach where we empower officers in MOE to act as duty bearers, to be held accountable towards making sure unity and equity are realized in schools, and also empowering its beneficiaries to take legal action if not done otherwise.
Cheryl, what about you?
There's two things. One, I think easy, one extremely difficult. The easy one, very specific, micro. There's this program called Rancangan Integrasi Murid untuk Perpaduan. Figure out the English translation later. Where school kids from different school streams come together and do co-curricular activities. So I think that that program was launched many years ago, but it's never really flown. Not enough budget maybe put into it. I think there's more that can be done for that, right? So that is within what's practical in the immediate term. In the long term, and this is a big dream, is for maybe a relook at the social contract overall. And for that to happen, I think there needs to be a readiness from the multiple communities that exist in this country to give and take. So very broadly speaking, what is it that the non-Malay community is willing to give up in exchange for what it is that the Malay community is willing to give up? And I think if we can get that to that point, and this is obviously beyond education, I think that's a model for our university and our multiracialism in the next decades.
Dipti, I thought you could have the final word.
Thank you, Trilin. I will talk more specifically about education equity, summarized based on those points. So as I mentioned earlier, I think we need to have the political will and ensure that our education system is working based on one objective, which I mentioned earlier, ensuring that we have the right environment space to accommodate children of different backgrounds, different learning abilities, different religions, accommodate and ensure that they're able to learn from each other and in the same space or not, right? But if I were to go, that is a huge cultural change, which who knows, we don't have a magic wand to do it overnight. But if I were to point out specifically what I think one or two key steps that we could take on the education system side, I would say as MCII, one of our key solutions, we use a solution tool called collaboration, right? So if any particular school has challenges surrounding, discrimination or even nutrition or teaching challenges or parental awareness, we want the schools to identify and take ownership of that. So what we always notice is the more ownership the community takes, the more educational equity we see happening in these schools. So autonomy and decentralization, to me, would be one of the first key steps. Autonomy and decentralization, and getting the schools to also learn what it's like to be more empowered. Now, this happens on paper. Supposedly, schools have full autonomy, have some extent of autonomy, but it needs to actually happen in culture, and in line with that, performance management of teachers. So I think all of us in the education space, we want to see teachers really being rewarded for developing those skills, for working hard on differentiation in the classroom, being able to identify children of different backgrounds, different learning abilities, socioeconomic backgrounds, and identify ways to support their individual growth. That this does happen in our schools today. It's organic, and it's because of the teacher's own will. So how can we further motivate these teachers? We have a performance management system that works on paper. It is not fully implemented in the schools. So that would be the two key things I would say. If we want to see more education equity on the ground, this could be the focus moving forward.
All right. And that's pretty much it. I mean, on that note, I wanted to thank you all for taking the time to be with us for the last hour. Our speakers this evening have been Jason Wee from Architects of Diversity, Dipti Kumar from the Malaysian Collective Impact Initiative, Dr. Oe San, Socioeconomic Analyst, and Cheryl Hamdan, UMNO Information Chief. And we've, of course, been discussing unity and equity in education. Next week's webinar is titled, and I think Dipti touched on it there, Teachers, Critical Components in Education. So do join us for that next Thursday at 6 p.m., basically same time, same place. And again, thank you to our speakers for taking the time. Thank you all so much for tuning in as well and for sharing your thoughts and questions. I'm Lee Chui Lin signing off. Have a great evening.